Great Lakes Prepping here with another canning video. Well, it's pear season in Michigan, and for me, that means whipping up a big batch of pear jam and canning it. Now, this video is going to be a little different than some of the other jam canning videos I've made because I'm actually going to do this using two different methods. Ordinarily, when I make jam, I do what most people do, and that's use fruit pectin as one of the key ingredients to make that jam turn into a nice gel and get that thick consistency that you would expect out of a jam. But I've also been reading about a different method that's been used for a long time that doesn't call for additional pectin. It basically uses the pectin in the existing ingredients to end up with that thicker gel-like consistency. Now, I've not done it that way before, but I figure as long as I'm going through the whole production of making fresh pear jam, I might as well try it and do it both ways. So that's what I'm gonna do in this video. So we're gonna do two batches, and I'll try to go through them as quickly as possible so this video doesn't last forever. One batch using the pectin, the other batch not using the pectin. The ingredients are otherwise identical, just the process is a bit different from one to the next. Pears, sugar, lemon juice. And this is all the pears I'm going to need for both batches, although I've only measured out the sugar and lemon juice for one of them so far. But as always, I'll have the full recipe with all the quantities in a link in the video description below. And the first thing I have to do is start breaking down these pears. Basically, I want to cut them up, get rid of the stem and the core and the seeds, and cut everything up into pretty small bits. Now, I'll mention that I'm starting with pears that are not quite ripe, and that's because I want there to be a little bit of texture in my jam. If they were super ripe and perfect for eating just as a pear, I'd actually end up with a bit of a mushier and non-textured jam, which is fine, but that's not what I'm going for. So my pears are a little more firm, they're a little not quite ripe, and I'll also mention that I'm not peeling these pears. To me, this is a completely optional step. You can peel the pears or blanch them and pull the skins off, but for me, I don't really think it makes any noticeable difference to have those skins in there because they're very thin and they end up getting completely soft and pretty much just becoming part of the overall texture of the jam. So I save myself the work and I don't peel the pears. And as I cut each one up, I'm gonna go ahead and throw it into this pot of water. And to make sure that my cut up pieces of pear don't start turning brown while I'm still working on all the others, I'm just gonna fill up this pot with some water and just a squirt of lemon juice. And as I go, I'm gonna throw my cut up bits of pear into that, and that's gonna help keep everything from turning brown when I don't want it to. And it'll all stay in this lemony water pretty much until I'm ready to move on to the next phase. All right, I've got my pears all cut up, and now I'm going to measure out the pears I need for the first batch. And this is gonna be for the version without pectin. Now, the thing about this method is that I actually have to get it prepared and let it sit in the refrigerator pretty much overnight. And I'm gonna measure out 2.5 pounds of these cut up pears because that's what each batch that I'm making calls for. And I'm gonna put them into this great big glass bowl. And next, I'm gonna stir in my lemon juice, that's 1/4 cup, and then my sugar, 3 cups. Now, I know that you're thinking that this seems like a ridiculous amount of sugar to pour over top of these pears at this point, but that's what you gotta do per everything that I've been seeing and reading. And the idea is that when you let this sit for 12 or even 24 hours, a lot of the sugar is going to start to soak into the pear pieces, but it's also going to start drawing out moisture from the pears. And what we should end up with after, say, 12 hours is a bowl of basically syrup with pears floating in it. And I can see it's already starting to do its work. So as for this version of the jam, this is as much as we can do today. I need to cover this up with some plastic wrap and stick it in the fridge, and we're gonna pick this one back up tomorrow. But in the meantime, we are gonna move on and do the pectin version today because there's no such waiting period for that one. And in the meantime, I'm getting my jars prepared. I'm sanitizing them in the canner pot. I've got a few inches of water in there and I'm letting it boil, which is steaming the jars and I'll sanitize them nicely. You can fill the whole canner up and boil the jars. This is how I do it, and since the processing time on these isn't very long, we have to do the jar sanitation step. And I'll also do similar to my lids. The traditional method was to boil your lids, but in more modern times, the ball companies actually suggested against doing that because you might maybe damage the rubber seal. But they say you can heat them up, even simmer them, just don't really boil them. So that's what what I do. And I'll end up leaving the jars in here on a low simmer until I'm ready for them, because the jam that I'm going to put into them is going to be molten hot, and that way I can put hot jam into hot jars. You know, you minimize that temperature fluctuation, you minimize the risk of a jar breaking. And so let's get our pectin version going. So just like before, I'm going to transfer 2.5 pounds of my cut up pears into this seemingly unnecessarily large pot, but I like to have a ton of room to account for spatter and foaming, and I definitely want to try to reduce my risk of making a huge mess when this goes on the stove. Now we're going to add the lemon juice, 1/4 cup, and give it a quick stir. And now it's going to the stove. Now we're going to add in our pectin. That's 1.75 ounces. Today I'm using the Jell, and 1.75 ounces is really just one box, but I've also used bulk pectin. You can buy it a lot cheaper in big bags, but you're going to have to measure out 1.75 ounces if you do it that way. And this is before I turn the heat on. I'm going to put this in and mix it all in. Now we're turning the heat on to high, and we're going to let this come up to a full boil. Now I'll mention that a lot of people recommend throwing in a little bit of butter at this point. They say it helps reduce the foaming. It just doesn't really quite sit well with me to put butter in this, because hot water bath canning fats like that is kind of a whole can of worms that I don't want to get into. So it's not a big deal. It foams up. I just skim the foam off with my little skimmer spoon thingy. And while it's coming up to that boil, I'm going to stir pretty much constantly, because I don't want any of my pears burning on the bottom of the pot. That would be really bad. It would pretty much ruin the batch. So always stirring, always stirring. All right, all the liquid in this pot is now up to a pretty good consistent boil. So now it's time to add all that sugar. Stir it in real thoroughly. Now I'm going to let this come back up to a full boil and let it go for a solid full minute. I'm going to make sure to stir it pretty much constantly, because again, I don't want anything to burn or scorch. And already I can tell that this is starting to gel up real nice. All right, it's been a full minute, so I'm turning off the heat. And at this point, we have a decision to make. If I was to can this up just like this, I'd have pear preserves. I'm going for jam, so I need to mash and pulp this up a little bit. And there's a couple ways I could do that. I could just go to town with the potato masher, but that's hardly efficient. So I like to go at it with the immersion blender. Very carefully, of course, because this is magma right now in this pot. And I'm not trying to completely liquefy this. I still want it to have some good jam texture, but I definitely don't want the big full chunks of pear like this. So I'll just kind of eyeball it and go till I think it's about right. And that looks pretty good to me. So now I'm going to carefully move my jars over to the counter, and we're going to start filling them up with this jam. And real quick, after I took the jars out of my canner, I filled the canner back up with water to about where I need it to be when I do the processing. And I've got the heat turned on. I want to start bringing the temperature of this water up. I don't want it at a full boil yet, but I want it pretty warm, because again, those jars are going to be full of hot jam, and I don't want to put these hot jars into cold water. So I need to kind of get that temperature closer to the same between the canner water and the jars before I dunk those jars in there for processing. And now it's time to start filling our jars. So I'll use my canning funnel and just start scooping jam in with a big measuring cup. And I want to fill these until they're 1/2 inch from the top. We're going 1/2 inch headspace. If we were doing 1/2 pint jars, we would go 1/4 inch headspace. And I am using pint jars. A lot of people like to go 1/2 pint for jam. I personally don't know why I would go through all this production to end up with some teeny tiny little jars that are practically a serving or two. I eyeballed that 1/2 inch headspace, but I want to double check with my little headspace measuring / debubbling tool. This second notch here is the 1/2 inch. If I rest that on the rim of the jar, I want the tip of the tool to touch the top edge of the jam. And it looks like I need a little bit more in that one. I need a little bit more in all 3 of these. So I'll just add a spoonful at a time until it's right. Now using the other end of this tool, we're going to debubble. And all that means is just kind of working it around the jar, making sure to get it against the inside walls of the jar. Want to dislodge any kind of stubborn air bubbles that might be trapped in there. We want as much air as possible to escape from the top, and if it's trapped down in there, it's not going to happen as readily. Next, we'll wipe the rims of the jars. So using a damp paper towel, I'm going to just thoroughly clean the edge of each one of these jars until I don't see any more residue. And this is especially important with a sloppy, sort of sticky product like this, because if anything obstructs that lid from forming a great seal against that glass, we're going to have a failed seal. So just go over it a bunch of times, taking care to not burn yourself, because again, these are super hot jars right now. Now I'll take my lids out of the little pot of water with my magnetic lid lifter tool, set them in place. And now we put on the rings. We want to put these on snug, but not super tight. They call it finger tight, just enough to know that it's on there. We don't want to use all of our might to twist that in place. Now these are ready to go back into that canner. And by the way, here's a little bonus tip that I started doing a while back, and I can't believe it never occurred to me to do this all along. And I was talking about the disparity of the temperature of these jars versus the water in the canner that we're about to dunk these into, and how we want that water to be pretty much the same in temperature or thereabouts so we don't risk breaking any glass. Well, if I use my little infrared thermometer here, I can see exactly how hot the outside of this glass is. Right now it's somewhere about 155 to 160-ish. And if I then come over and use it on my pot of water, I can get it pretty darn close. And right there, that's really close. So I'm putting the jars in right now. Okay, the jars are in, my heat's up to high, and I want to make sure that I have a good inch of water over the top of these jars, and I think I'm in good shape here. If you needed to add a little more water, you could do so at this point. Just make sure to heat it up in a kettle or something so it's about the same temperature as the water that's in there already. Now I have to let this whole thing come up to a full rolling boil. At that time, the processing has begun. So I'm going to put the lid on. And once it comes up to that full boil, I'm going to set my timer for 10 minutes. You need 10 minutes of processing time for pints and half pints. And again, that time only starts when that water reaches the full boil. So we'll pick it up then and go to the next step. Another quick note. Earlier I was talking about people adding butter to the pot to sort of prevent it from foaming up a lot, and that I'm okay with just skimming the foam off with my little tool. Well, it didn't occur to me till just about right now that I never really had any of that foam. I've definitely made batches of jams where there's an inch or two of foam forming on the top and you have to skim all of it off. But for whatever reason today, I didn't get any of that. My jam seems to be good jam, so I can't see any problem with not having that foam form on the top. So I guess I'll just call that a win. All right, we're at a full boil, so I'm gonna go ahead and set my timer to 10 minutes and we'll pick it up there. All right, processing is done. Heat is off. And I'm just gonna let these sit in here for about 5 more minutes, let the temperature just start to come down a teeny bit before I pull these jars out into the cool air. And again, using the jar lifter tool, I'll carefully move them over to a towel on the counter. The towel protects the counter, but it also protects the jars from the temperature of the cold counter. And now there's nothing more to do for now except wait. I need to let these jars come completely down to room temperature, many hours, and sometime in the next little while I'll expect to hear each of the lids pop. That's the lid being sucked inward, thereby signifying a successful sealing. And as always, if any of them don't pop, that means the seal for some reason was not successful. It happens sometimes, and it happens to everyone. In that case, I would just take that particular jar and put it in the fridge and use it first. Hopefully all these jars will have sealed successfully, and they'll be ready to put up in the pantry. And ordinarily I'd end a canning video right here, but we still have that other version of the jam to make. So we're gonna jump ahead a little bit to tomorrow and see about whipping up that second batch. Okay, so here we are the next day, and we've got our sugary, syrupy bowl of pear pieces. And I just need to transfer all of this into my big stock pot. Now we're turning the heat on high, and we're gonna let everything come up to a boil. And again, stirring pretty regularly. All right, we're just coming up to a boil here, and from this point, I just need to let it cook for about 15 minutes. I need to get the temperature up to 220 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's at this point that I am gonna blend it up a little bit with that immersion blender to get my more jam consistency. And I'll just keep stirring and stirring, and you can see that I am starting to get some of that foam on top. And I'm not gonna worry about that right now. Depending on how much is there, by the time I need to pull this off the heat, I may end up skimming some of this off, but we'll see how it goes between now and then. All right, we've been going about 8 minutes, and it's still not quite up to 220. I think if I turned my burner up full blast, it would have happened sooner, but I want to try to make sure that it gets at least that 10-15 minute cook time, and hopefully right around then is when it hits the 220, and that's when it should really start sort of gelling up. So hopefully it does, and I guess we'll find out. All right, it's been somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes, and I have hit that 220 degrees. And I went to skim some of this foam off, but as soon as I pulled the foam kind of out of that heat, it all just turned back into liquid. So I'm kind of thinking I don't need to bother skimming it because it's just going to settle back down in there. And I can see that this is definitely thickened up, and I guess maybe it's gelled. It's not as gel-like as the Pectin version at this point, but it is kinda. So I don't want to way overcook this, so I think I'm at about the point where I need to pull it off the heat and start canning it. And we're gonna do this exactly like we did the first batch. Fill the jars up, leaving a 1/2 inch headspace. Debubble, wipe the rims, put on the lids and rings. Make sure the temperature of our jars is about the same as the temperature of the canner water. Put the jars in the canner. Bring that water in the canner up to a full rolling boil. Start our 10-minute processing time. Give them a few more minutes in the canner with the heat off, and then transfer them over to the countertop. And there we are. Oh, something I find pretty interesting is that I only got 2 jars out of this batch, starting with the exact same quantity of ingredients for both batches, with the only exception being the added pectin powder in the first batch, which certainly shouldn't be enough to make up an entire extra pint jar. The best I can figure is that a lot was lost in the boiling process of the second batch. Still, it seems pretty surprising that an entire pint's worth boiled away. I can't really make a whole lot of sense of it, but I had pretty much exactly 2 pints worth in that second batch in the pot, to the point where I was scraping the bottom with a spoon just to make sure both of these were filled all the way to the top where they need to be. But anyway, they look like pretty good jars of jam. They look like they've gelled up. I guess I'll find out for sure once I can give both versions a little sample. And to compare it with the Pectin version from yesterday, they came out looking more or less the same. I think I might have processed these a little more with that immersion blender, but otherwise colors pretty similar, as is the overall appearance. So like I did with the first batch yesterday, I'm gonna let these come completely down to room temperature, and then sometime either later today or tomorrow, I'm gonna pop one of each of the jars open and give it a taste test. All right, let's see how these 2 different versions compared. Admittedly, I already popped open one of them and gave it a little sample. In this jar is the one that was made with the pectin. It's got a really nice, thick gel consistency, pretty much exactly what I would expect out of my jam. And I haven't actually even opened one of the non-pectin jars until this very moment. So we're gonna see how it came out. Wow, I think it's actually a bit more viscous than the Pectin version. There's definitely a bit of a difference to it in texture. It seems maybe like it's more sticky and kind of lumpy, but it's definitely thick like jam. It's definitely got a glossier sort of shininess to it that I don't know if that'll come out in the video, but it's just maybe it's because it was cooked so much longer, it's caramelized a little bit differently. First, the Pectin version. And again, I have actually already tasted this one, and it's pretty good. Sweet, lots of great pear flavor, just the right consistency. Let's try the no pectin version. It's definitely different and in pretty interesting ways. Right off the bat, it's less sweet. It's quite a bit less sweet than the pectin version. Now that powdered pectin itself could be adding more sweetness, but other than that, both recipes have the exact same amount of sugar and pears and everything else, so it's a little fascinating how much less sweet the non-pectin version is. I actually prefer it. I don't need it to be super overly sweet, and I rather like the less sweetness of this version. That being said, I don't like the consistency or texture as much. Like I said, it's caramelized and kind of, I don't know, almost gotten sticky or almost like candied fruit, which is weird because it's less sweet, but that kind of more chewy candied fruit texture I'm not a huge fan of, but the flavor, super good. In the future, I'm not sure what I'll do. As for which way you should do it, well, it's gonna be up to you. Do you like it more sweet? Do you like it less kind of chewy and almost candied in texture? These are the factors, I guess, that'll help you decide which way to go. So that's about it for now. Be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future jam making videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, this is Great Lakes Prepping.